Have you ever loved someone so deeply that you fought for them through everything, only to realize that letting go might be the only way to save yourself? This is Emma's story. A tale of love, sacrifice, and the moment when walking away changed everything. If this resonates with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that touch the heart and heal the soul. Emma stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back at her. Dark circles shadowed her once bright eyes, and her smile, the one David had fallen in love with 7 years ago, had faded into a thin, tired line. She splashed cold water on her face, trying to wash away the remnants of last night's tears. This morning felt different somehow. The familiar ache in her chest remained, but alongside it bloomed something new, resolve. For 7 years, Emma had been fighting. Fighting for David's attention when he'd drift away into his work. Fighting for his affection when he'd grow cold and distant. Fighting for their relationship when he'd take her for granted time and again. She'd planned surprise dates, written heartfelt letters, suggested couples therapy, anything to keep the flame alive. But this morning, as she dried her face with a towel that still carried his scent, Emma made a decision that would change everything. She was done fighting. The realization hadn't come suddenly. It had built slowly, like water gradually eroding stone. Last night had been the breaking point, David's forgotten anniversary, his casual dismissal of her hurt feelings, the way he'd fallen asleep while she cried silently beside him. 7 years of memories flashed through her mind, the early days when his eyes would light up at the sight of her, the gradual cooling of his affection, the increasing silence between them. She'd given everything to this relationship, poured her whole heart into loving this man, and somewhere along the way, she'd lost herself. Emma opened the bathroom cabinet and reached for her makeup bag. Today, she would put on her favorite lipstick, the bold red one David had once said was too much. She would wear the dress that made her feel beautiful, regardless of whether he noticed. Today, she would begin the painful process of reclaiming her heart. David noticed the shift immediately, though he couldn't quite place what had changed. Emma still made coffee in the morning, still asked about his day, still moved through their shared apartment with the same quiet grace. But something essential had vanished. The pleading look in her eyes when he came home late was gone. The gentle suggestions for weekend plans together had stopped. The way she used to reach for his hand across the dinner table, that too had disappeared. At first, he felt relief. The pressure to respond, to engage, to be more than he felt capable of being had lifted. He had more space, more freedom. Emma no longer waited up for him when he worked late. She no longer texted throughout the day just to check in. She no longer initiated conversations about where things were going. David told himself this was good, this was what he'd wanted all along. But as days turned into weeks, the silence between them grew heavier, more significant. He found himself glancing at his phone during meetings, expecting messages that never came. He'd arrive home earlier, only to find Emma absorbed in a book or on the phone with friends, her life continuing without centering him at its core. The apartment felt different too. New plants appeared that he hadn't helped choose. The refrigerator stocked foods he didn't recognize. Emma was building a life that could exist without him, and the realization hit him with unexpected force. One Tuesday evening, David came home to find Emma's side of the closet partially empty. Panic surged through him as he called her name, receiving no answer. He rushed through the apartment, finding a note on the kitchen counter, staying at Sophia's for a few days. Need some space to think. David sank into a kitchen chair, the note trembling in his hand. Space? Emma had never asked for space before. She had always been the one trying to close the distance between them, not create more. He pulled out his phone to call her, then stopped. What would he say? That he was sorry? For what, specifically? The truth was, he couldn't pinpoint exactly when things had started to go wrong, when he'd begun taking her presence for granted. Instead, he wandered through their apartment, seeing it through new eyes. The photographs on the walls were mostly of Emma alone or with friends and family. How few captured the two of them together. Had he declined so many invitations that she'd stopped asking him to join? In the kitchen, he noticed the cookbook she'd bought months ago, filled with recipes she'd wanted to try together. He'd always been too busy or too tired. In the living room, concert tickets were pinned to a bulletin board, events she'd gone to without him because he couldn't make the time. David opened her closet, running his fingers along the dresses he'd never complimented, the sweaters he'd never noticed. On her nightstand sat a journal he'd never seen before, and beside it, a stack of books with titles like Reclaiming Your Independence and Loving Yourself First. David sat heavily on the edge of their bed, the bed where they'd once whispered dreams to each other until dawn, the bed that now felt cold on her side most mornings when he woke. Emma was slipping away, and the terrifying truth was that she wasn't fighting to stay anymore. That night, David couldn't sleep. He scrolled through their text messages from the past year, seeing the pattern with painful clarity. Her long, thoughtful messages gradually met with his short replies. Her invitations and suggestions met with his excuses and rain checks. The "I love yous" that she sent faithfully, even when he forgot to respond. When had he become this person? When had he started taking for granted that Emma would always be there, always trying, always fighting for them? He found himself opening old photo albums on his phone, traveling back to the beginning. Emma laughing as he twirled her on a beach at sunset. Emma asleep on his shoulder during a long flight. Emma in the kitchen of their first apartment, dancing to music only she could hear. He'd been so in love with her then, her spirit, her kindness, her unwavering belief in him and in them. When had he stopped seeing her? When had her love become something he expected rather than something he treasured? David spent the next 3 days in a fog of regret and fear. He called Emma once, but the conversation was brief and stilted. She needed time, she said. She wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. Each word felt like another brick in a wall being built between them. At work, he couldn't focus. His colleagues noticed his distraction, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he checked his phone constantly. "Everything okay at home?" his boss asked after he fumbled through a presentation. David just nodded, unable to admit that he might have destroyed the best thing in his life through sheer negligence. On the 4th day, he left work early and drove to Sophia's apartment. He needed to see Emma, to tell her, what? That he was sorry? That he would change? Empty promises he'd made before during their rare arguments, promises that had evaporated like morning dew once the immediate crisis passed. Sophia answered the door, her expression cool and assessing. "She's not here," she said before he could speak. "And even if she was, I'm not sure she'd want to see you." "Please," David said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely showed. "I just need 5 minutes." Sophia crossed her arms. "You've had 7 years, David. 7 years of Emma giving and you taking. Do you know how many nights she's cried on my couch? How many times she's asked me what she's doing wrong, why she can't make you happy?" Each word was a knife, cutting through the comfortable illusions he'd built around himself. "I didn't know," he said weakly. "That's the problem," Sophia replied. "You never bothered to know. Emma deserves someone who sees her, really sees her." "I see her now," David whispered. Sophia's expression softened slightly. "Sometimes it takes losing something to recognize its value. But recognition isn't enough, David. Emma needs more than that." She gave him Emma's new temporary phone number. She'd changed it, another sign of her pulling away, but warned him not to expect much. "She's finally putting herself first," Sophia said. And honestly, it's long overdue. When Emma finally agreed to meet him, a week had passed. They met at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown where they'd had their 3rd date, years ago. David arrived early, his heart pounding as he waited. When she walked in, the sight of her took his breath away. She looked different somehow, lighter, as if she'd set down a heavy burden. Her hair was shorter, falling in soft waves around her face. She wore a yellow dress he'd never seen before, and there was a quiet confidence in her movements that made his chest ache with longing and regret. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as she sat down across from him. Emma nodded, her eyes clear and direct in a way that made him realize she'd been preparing for this conversation far longer than he had. "What did you want to talk about, David?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. In the past, she would have filled the silence, would have worked to make this easier for him. But this new Emma waited, patient and self-contained. "I miss you," he said simply. "I miss us." Emma's smile was sad. "Which us do you miss, David? The one from the beginning, when we couldn't get enough of each other? Or the one from the last few years, where I gave and you took, and we both pretended it was enough?" Her honesty stung, but he knew he deserved it. "I miss the real us," he said. "The us we could be if I hadn't been so blind. So selfish." Emma studied him, her gaze searching. "What changed? Why now?" "Because you stopped fighting for us," he admitted, the words painful but necessary. "And it made me realize that I never really started. You've been carrying this relationship on your shoulders for years, and I let you because it was easier than facing my own fears." "What fears?" she asked quietly. David took a deep breath. This was the part he'd never told her, the truth he'd barely admitted to himself. Fear of not being enough. Fear that if I gave you all of me, you'd eventually realize I wasn't worth the effort. So I held back. I created distance. And then I blamed you for trying to close it." Tears gathered in Emma's eyes, but she blinked them away. "Do you know how many times I wondered what I was doing wrong? How many nights I lay awake trying to figure out how to make you love me the way you used to?" "There was nothing wrong with you," David said, reaching across the table to take her hand. To his relief, she didn't pull away. "The problem was always me. My insecurities. My inability to believe that someone as amazing as you could really love someone like me." Emma shook her head. "That's not fair, David. You never gave me the chance to prove it. You never let me in." "I know," he acknowledged. "And I don't know if I deserve another chance, but I'm asking for one. Not because I'm panicking, though I am, but because losing you has made me see what I've had all along." Emma withdrew her hand gently. "Words are easy, David. I've heard promises before." "I know," he acknowledged. "And I know I can't convince you with words today. But I'm asking you to let me show you. Day by day. I want to be the one fighting for us now." Emma was silent for a long moment, considering. "I need time," she finally said. "I've spent years molding myself to fit what I thought you wanted. I need to figure out who I am without doing that." It wasn't the answer he'd hoped for, but it wasn't a definitive no either. "I understand," David said, though the prospect of more time apart made his chest tighten with fear. "Can I call you? Maybe we could meet again next week?" Emma nodded slowly. "I'd like that. But David..." She hesitated, then continued, "I can't go back to how things were. I won't be the only one trying anymore." "You won't be," he promised. "Whatever happens between us, that part is over." As they parted outside the coffee shop, David watched Emma walk away, her yellow dress bright against the gray city backdrop. He felt a strange mixture of hope and fear. He had no idea if he could win her back, if he could become the man she deserved. But for the first time in years, he was determined to try. The weeks that followed weren't easy. David had to unlearn years of emotional distance, had to face the uncomfortable truth that he'd been coasting in their relationship while Emma carried the weight. There were awkward conversations, painful revelations, moments when both wondered if they could bridge the chasm that had formed between them. Their first attempt at a date was a disaster. David had planned everything meticulously, dinner at her favorite restaurant, tickets to a show she'd mentioned wanting to see. But the conversation was stilted, both of them too aware of the fragility of what they were trying to rebuild. When he reached for her hand across the table, an echo of how she used to reach for his, Emma hesitated before allowing the contact. The moment crystallized for David just how much damage his neglect had caused, how much trust he had to rebuild. "This isn't working, is it?" Emma said softly as they walked back to her car afterward. David's heart sank, but he forced himself to be honest. "It feels forced," he admitted. "Like we're trying too hard to recreate something instead of building something new." Emma nodded, relief evident in her expression. "Exactly. It's like we're playing roles, the attentive boyfriend, the appreciative girlfriend. It doesn't feel real." "What would feel real?" David asked. Emma considered the question. "Maybe we need to stop trying to have perfect dates and just talk. Really talk. About everything that went wrong, about what we both want now." And so they did. They met at parks, at quiet cafes, once even at a bookstore where they wandered the aisles, pulling books that had meant something to them, sharing pieces of themselves through the stories they loved. David learned things about Emma he'd never known, her childhood dream of becoming a marine biologist, her secret fear of thunderstorms, the poetry she'd been writing for years but never shared with him. In turn, he opened up about his own fears and dreams. How his father's emotional distance had shaped his own inability to connect. How his drive at work came from a deep-seated fear of failure. How he'd always admired Emma's emotional courage but had been too afraid to emulate it. "Why didn't you ever tell me these things before?" Emma asked during one of their conversations. David thought about it. "I think I was afraid that if you saw all of me, the insecurities, the flaws, you wouldn't love me anymore. So I kept parts of myself hidden, which only made me feel more disconnected." "That's the irony," Emma said softly. "I fell in love with glimpses of the real you. All these years, I've been trying to get back to that person I met at the beginning, the one who wasn't afraid to be vulnerable with me." Slowly, something new began to grow in the space where Emma had stopped fighting. David started sending the midday texts, planning the surprise dates, initiating the difficult conversations about their future. He started noticing, really noticing, the small things that made Emma who she was. The way she hummed while cooking. The specific smile she reserved for children and dogs. The passionate way she talked about her work. But it wasn't just about David changing. Emma was changing too, growing into a version of herself that didn't automatically put his needs above her own. She maintained her newfound independence, continuing to nurture her friendships and interests outside their relationship. She spoke her mind more freely, no longer filtering her thoughts to avoid potential conflict. And gradually, she allowed herself to be vulnerable again, to believe that perhaps this time, things could be different. 3 months after their separation, Emma agreed to move back into their apartment, with conditions. They would continue couples therapy, which they'd started during their time apart. They would respect each other's need for individual space and interests. And most importantly, they would communicate honestly, even when it was difficult. The first night she was back, David presented her with a key to a small studio space he'd rented for her. "For your writing," he explained. "A place that's just yours." Emma's eyes filled with tears, happy ones this time. "You remembered," she whispered. Years ago, she'd mentioned wanting a dedicated space for her poetry, a dream David had dismissed as impractical. "I'm trying to remember everything," he said. "And when I can't remember, I'm trying to ask." There were setbacks, of course. Old patterns didn't disappear overnight. David still retreated into work when stressed, Emma still occasionally fell into the habit of silencing her own needs. But now, they caught themselves sooner. They had tools to recognize the warning signs, to pull back from the brink before small issues became insurmountable problems. 6 months after Emma had walked away, they sat together on a beach at sunset, the same beach where they'd taken one of their first photos together. David's arm wrapped around Emma's shoulders as they watched the waves crash against the shore. "Do you remember what you said that night at the coffee shop?" Emma asked, her head resting against his chest. "About wanting to be the one fighting for us?" David nodded, pressing a kiss to her.